6 o'clock, so we will get started. Welcome, everybody. So last week we talked about, in general, the whole idea of sacrifices, because we are in Leviticus, and Leviticus is a lot of sacrifices. So we talked about that in general. And this week's Torah portion is Zav. And of course, we are deep into the sacrifices. And so I was trying to figure out what it is should we talk about. I was trying to stay away from some of the more technical aspects of things. But I took a look. There's a couple of verses that I'd like to focus on. You may think it's a small detail or whatever, but I think even some of these small details are things that we can gain meaning from. So we're going to start reading from chapter 7, verse 23. Okay, well, 22, and the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, speak to the Israelite people thus. You shall eat no fat of ox or sheep or goat. Fat from animals that died or were torn by beasts may be put to any use, but you must not eat it. If anyone eats the fat of animals from which offerings by fire may be weighed to the Lord, the person who eats it shall be cut off. And you must not consume any blood, either of bird or of animal, in any of your settlements. Anyone who eats blood shall be cut off from the nation. Okay, so first of all, this punishment in both cases, being cut off or cut off from the nation, this is considered the most severe punishment in the Bible. It is a punishment that is actually seen to be meted out by God. This is not a punishment that any kind of a court of law is going to do. It's not a death penalty or anything like that. What it's usually thought to mean is that you will have no descendants, or your descendants will die out, disappear, be cut off from the nation. Clearly, this is something that is up to God, but it's the power of the statement. It's basically saying, you're no more. You've cut yourself off from the Jewish people. Okay, so it's these kind of this kind of punishment. For example, if you eat on Yom Kippur, on the Day of Atonement, okay, well, that could be a very serious thing. But here we're talking about just eating a certain kind of fat and eating blood from animals. Why is this so serious? Okay, first of all, what's the point of the whole thing? What's the meaning of this? And why is it so serious? Now, I will preface my talk today by saying, I don't know that I'm going to really answer this question. At the end of the day, why is this so serious? I don't really know. And I did a bit of research, and I looked at a number of commentaries, and all of the commentaries give meanings, give ideas, give understandings, but all of them start out by saying there are rules and laws in the Bible that God has commanded that we have no clue why. And so I want to preface what I'm saying by that. If you think you're going to walk out of this class today feeling, I got it, I know the problem with fat, and I know the problem with blood, I don't think that's going to happen. But I'm hoping that at the end of our teaching today, we'll at least gain a little bit of meaning. Okay? So first of all, let's talk about the fat part. If you'll notice, it says here two things about the fat. One is that it's coming from three particular animals, an ox or a cow, a sheep, and a goat. Only the fat from those animals, okay? Now, we get a little bit more detail about this fat thing in Leviticus 3, where this is actually the first time that both of these issues are mentioned, about the blood and the fat. Leviticus 3, verse 17. First of all, before verse 17, we're talking about Aaron bringing various sacrifices. Let's go to verse 14 first. He shall then present as his offering from it as an offering by fire to the Lord, the fat that covers the entrails and all the fat that is about the entrails, the 2 kidneys and the fat that is on them, that is at the loins, and the protuberance on the liver, which he shall remove from the kidneys. The priest shall turn these into smoke on the altar as food, and offering by fire of pleasing order. All fat is the Lord's. It is a law for all time throughout the ages. In all your settlements, you must not eat any fat or any blood. Okay? What we learn from this is that first of all, the end of those verses tells us in general, not just having to do with sacrifices. You want to have some steak, you want to have a good meal, whatever. You cannot eat this particular fat, and it's not any fat. It's only the fat that is mentioned there on the internal or digestive organs, on the kidneys, and on the flanks. Not all the fat of the beet, okay? But one of the things we learned there is that it is these things, the blood and the fat, that go, let's talk about the fat. It's the fat that goes on the altar. When a priest brings a sacrifice and there's different parts of the animal, the part of the animal that will always go on the altar, that will never be eaten, okay, but it's all to the Lord. That is the fat, this particular fat on these particular 3 places, okay? So one of the things if we go back to our verse here in chapter 7, we can keep in mind what we already know about this, that we're not just talking about all fat, we're talking about a specific fat in specific locations, and that this is something that normally will go on the altar if it were part of a sacrifice. And what we're learning here is that even if you have a meat that is not for sacrificial purposes, you're home, you want to barbecue or you want to roast, okay, and you have a cow, goat, or sheep, then you still are not allowed to have the fat from those 3 places. Did someone have a question? Okay. All right. So that's one. Now the next thing is, so the question is why? Okay, let's focus on the fat. Now we'll get to the blood afterwards. Why? Now I've looked at some of the commentators I'm looking at, most of them are actually commentators, very, very standard, very brilliant men from the Middle Ages. So their knowledge of medicine was very different from ours, and they had different ways of looking at things, some of which you may relate to and some of which you may not relate to. But I think it was very interesting, and I'm basically going to present to you 3 different ways of looking at this. One is that there's a direction that says there's an actual physical issue here. There is something bad for you in these parts, this type of fat. It's bad for you, and if you eat it, it will have negative effects on your body. Now, I have no idea if that is considered the case in medicine. I don't know, Faye, you're a doctor.
Well, yeah, but and it's just the abdominal fat that you can't eat.
No, it's the fat that's outside, like on top of the surgeon of the digestive organs.
Yeah, but that's with abdominal fat. It's what's inside your belly. Yeah, because that is
what's wrapped onto the organs themselves.
Yeah, and it's interesting that there's a lot of evidence coming that it's that fat that causes heart disease and various problems. And I'm not very knowledgeable in it because I don't have to deal with that anymore. But
it's not all fat. In other words, when we eat, when you have a rib steak and you see the ribbons of fat there, that's not this fat.
Yeah, it's the fat inside the abdomen.
Right,
yeah,
right.
Yeah. And
so anyway, yes, and it was very interesting that some of these people wrote that they weren't sure exactly how it affected it. Some of them really believed medically that this was the case, and others believed that because God commanded it, it must be that it is physically unhealthy for you.
Yeah,
okay,
well, I think that's right. Yeah.
Okay. Now, then there are others that went in a more symbolic direction, didn't think it was actually bad for you in any direct way, but that the commandment to refrain from eating it is supposed to give us a message because of what it symbolizes. And one of these I thought was very interesting. A man by the name of Abarbanel. He was actually a very interesting man. He lived in the 15th century, and he was the minister of finance for Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand of Spain. And in fact, he was in that amazing position even when they announced that all Jews were going to be expelled from Spain as part of the Inquisition. And he had such a high position, and he literally ran the treasury. Not only was he expelled, but he tried very hard to change the mind of the king and queen to avoid this decree, and was not successful. So, but he was quite a man of the world, but at the same time, he was a very brilliant Bible scholar. And so he looks at two things. He says he actually talks about the blood and the fat here, and he relates blood to health and fat to beauty. Now, I find that very interesting. We all know that any of you have seen paintings going back from the late Middle Ages and the early Renaissance. Women were considered beautiful if they were fat. Okay. And this is even in biblical times. We know that people were considered healthy, particularly beautiful if they were fat. We don't have the same way of looking at beauty anymore. I think a lot of us would be a lot happier if fat was considered beautiful, but okay. Anyway, and so he basically says he connects blood with health, and that's obvious. We know that blood is the essence of life. You know, the fact that blood circulates in your body, it means you're alive. And he looks at blood as, on the one hand, being a key to life, physical life, but on the other hand, blood, and he takes this idea, he says, when you are angry, your blood boils. Now, we say that as a matter of, as an expression. I think he took it a little more literally, okay? And he was saying your blood boils when you're angry. And his message here was that this same blood, okay, is a life force, and the same time can be the root of sin, anger being something that you shouldn't do. It's like sin. He looked the same thing for fat. And here I thought the message is much easier for us to relate to, I think. He said, beauty, fat is beautiful. On the other hand, we have this wonderful scripture in the Song of Moses at the end of Deuteronomy 32. And he says, and Jeshurun is a synonym for Israel. Jeshurun became fat and kicked. Okay, kicked. Now, what does it mean there? It means that, and it's actually a prophetic statement where Moses is saying, what will one day happen to the nation of Israel? They will become fat and they will kick out God. And it's a very classic, and this actual verse is something that is very important in Jewish tradition, and this concept is something that we come back to over and over again. What happens to you when you are too prosperous? What happens to you when life becomes too easy? You become fat, literally. You're living fat off the land, as they'll say, okay? At that point, you forget that you owe God, that God is the one who's giving you all these wonderful blessings. And you forget God, you turn your back on God, and you forget about your obligations. You literally kick God, okay? And that is, so what this commentary, what he said is, again, like blood, which on the one hand can be the source of health, and yet on the other hand, it is something that is connected to rage, which is a sin. Here, he's saying fat, on the one hand, can represent beauty, but on the other hand, too much of this fat can end up creating sin where you would turn your back against God. And I think this idea of excessive fat, I think, is a very, very important concept here, because a certain amount of fat, a certain amount of blessing, a certain amount of whatever is fine. But when it's excessive, that's when things become a problem. And he connects this with the idea of these are the parts, this fat, as we said, this is what goes on the altar. Okay. And so basically what he is saying, if you want to ensure that you are not going to sin, that you are not going to allow some of these instincts to lead you astray, you have to put these things on the altar. You have to take certain things and say, this is for God, not just keeping God in mind, but the very act of saying, this is not for me, this is for God, enables you to check those impulses that would normally lead you astray. So you have a combination of saying, this is for God. And on the other hand, you're saying, there are things I'm not allowed to do. You're keeping yourself in discipline as opposed to allowing you go to excess where you could end up in sin. Now, there's another interesting connection, I think, with another commentary that brings this idea also of the fact that this fat is something that goes on the altar. And he sees this in a different sort of way. And he's saying the very fact that these are things that go on the altar means that if you were to eat them, in some way you would be acting in disrespect to God. It would be, damaging or disrespectful or damaging your attitude towards God. Because if this type of thing, when it is a sacrifice, belongs to God, so that even when it's not a sacrifice, it's not something you should be touching. You need to respect the fact that God has said this is for God. So even when it's not for God, even if it's an animal that's not a sacrifice, so it's not literally going on the altar, it's in a way you're remembering that there are things that belong to God, and that is not for you to touch. And I think those little commentaries actually go together in a very, very nice way. So in these commentaries, we saw they take a symbolic view. Okay, they're trying to say, what is the meaning here of this refraining from eating the fat? There is a third approach, and that approach is spiritual. Now, when I say spiritual, it's different from symbolic. Spiritual means that there is almost in a physical sense, except in the way that eating something will affect your health physically, like eating fat might give you a heart attack or something. When something is a spiritual issue, it literally affects something about your spiritual well-being. Okay. And so these people believe that there must be something, again, they can't prove it. There's nothing you can say that's empirically, provable when you're talking about something spiritual, but they're assuming because the punishment is so strict and because the commandment is so clear here, not to eat the fat, not to eat the blood, they're assuming that if you were to eat the fat or the blood, it would affect you spiritually. It would do something to your spiritual well-being. Okay, so that's more or less, I'm giving you an overview of the way they looked at the fat thing. Okay, by the way, one of the things that's very interesting about this fat thing, I think, it seems, at least this is from, I studied this a bit in the Talmud, this issue of the fat. And there's, in one of the tractates of the Talmud, there's a discussion about what happens if you have a jar or a container of fat and you're not sure if the fat is this kind of fat that you're not allowed to eat, or it's regular fat that you are allowed to eat. And I think it's very interesting because that assumption that, again, believe me, I've never slaughtered an animal. I don't want to ever see an animal, in the insides of an animal. So I am talking completely ignorantly here about what these things really look like. But the assumption there is that once the fat is separated from its position in the animal, it looks like fat. It doesn't look different. Okay, so it's just an interesting thing that what they had to do in today, I don't know exactly what they do, but what they're talking in the Talmud is that they would they would have, I guess they would keep the fat because they wanted to put it on the altar, and then they had to be sure not to get it mixed up with the other kind of fat that would be okay to eat. And there was a whole discussion there. What happens if you get mixed up? What happens, so that was clearly something that during the temple, they were very, very into. Here today, you slaughter an animal, you just get rid of that fat. The slaughterers, the kosher slaughterers know exactly what you can't eat. They just get rid of it right away. They're not saving any of it to use for something else. Okay, now I want to just spend a few minutes on the issue of blood. And here, I find it very interesting, this issue of blood. And to me, it immediately creates an association with the verse in Genesis that talks about blood. Genesis 9. This is God speaking to Noah after the flood, and he's giving him a commandment. He's actually telling him that he can actually eat meat. The assumption here is that until this point, Noah was probably a vegetarian. But anyway, in that context, let's read a few of the verses in Genesis 9, starting with verse 4. You must not, however, eat flesh with its lifeblood in it, but for your, and let me, actually, that I just read from the English, if I would do a more literal translation, it would be, but you should not eat meat that still has blood in its body or in its soul. Not soul in the spiritual sense, but in other words, that it still has this life force of blood running through it. But for your own lifeblood, I will require a reckoning. I will require it of every beast, of man too. Will I require a reckoning for human life of every man for that of his fellow man? Here, where there's a commandment, the commandment here is not about not eating blood. The commandment here is not eating an animal when it's alive. In other words, what the verse 4 is telling us, you cannot take a live animal, rip off. I know this sounds absolutely gross. You can't rip off a piece of leg or something from an animal that is still alive and eat it. You can cook, you can't. This tells us we have to first kill the animal. And of course, under Jewish law, there's specifically ways of killing the animal that are considered to be very humane. It's very instantaneous. It's not prolonging the injury. We don't shoot animals, for example. Okay, you slaughter them at the neck, and it's like an instantaneous kind of death. And this is the opposite. This is saying literally while an animal's alive, pulling off a thing, and a limb or something, and eating it. So this is absolutely not allowed. But the way the prohibition is worded is that it's linked to the blood. It doesn't say don't take something while the animal's alive. It's saying don't take this limb from the animal while there's still blood flowing through the body. That's essentially what it's saying. So this blood flowing through the body is about life. And you're not supposed to, eat a live animal. That's what it's saying. And then it connects immediately to the next verse where we learn about murder. Do not take the life of somebody else. But then again, it is all written in the terms of blood. Don't take the life of somebody else. Don't kill somebody else while he has blood flowing in him. You know what I'm saying? The blood is the life force. And when you kill somebody, you are stopping that flow of blood. Okay. So if I take these ideas and I bring them back to this prohibition from eating blood in a dead animal. Okay. You killed the animal in the right way. You brought a sacrifice, or you barbecued it, or whatever you did with your meat. Why can't you eat the blood? Okay. So I think here the idea is that the blood itself represents the essence of life. When God says don't murder somebody, he takes this prohibition in context of the blood that still runs through a person. It's still part of who they are. And to me, then, the meaning behind this is that when you're eating blood, it's a little bit too close to the idea of taking a life. Now, we're allowed to have meat, okay? And you can say that's taking a life. It certainly is. And there are people who are vegetarians who will not eat meat because they believe it is wrong to take an animal's life. The Bible gives us the ability to take the animal's life, okay? But when you're drinking the blood, it makes you, it's almost as if it's too coarse. It's too close to this idea of reveling in the taking of the life. I'm going to drink the blood. I'm going to drink that which is the life force in a living being, whether it's a human being or whether it's an animal. And so I think here that, to me, there's a symbolic issue here, but it's very possible that there's a spiritual element here, that drinking the blood will somehow damage you spiritually, will affect your soul in some way if you are drinking the blood. This is the meaning that I take from this. Now, this idea of drinking the blood is something that is a very important element in the kosher rules. After an animal is slaughtered, and it doesn't matter if it's a chicken or a cow or a turkey or whatever, the animal is dead, okay? And it's everything's, it's ready to be eaten. It took off the feathers, you've taken off the skin, whatever it is you do, the meat is ready to be eaten, to cook. We have one more step that we do. And what do? We salt the meat. We salt and soak the meat so that whatever possible remnants of blood may still be in that animal drain out. And that is a very important process of ensuring that the meat we eat is kosher. And it comes from this whole thing. We have to be sure that we're not eating any blood. One of the things that I think is actually, a friend pointed this out to me not too long ago, and I had never thought of this irony, but I wanted to share it with you. I don't know if you're familiar, but one of the classic ways of expressions of anti-Semitism, particularly in the Middle Ages, but even more recently, was something called the blood libel. And we're now at Passover, okay? This is the time of the blood libels. There was, and by the way, I understand that even today in some Muslim countries, some of the newspapers continue to print this blood libel, okay? The blood libel says that, and it's Christian in origin, by the way. The blood libel says that Jews need blood. They use blood to make matzah for Passover. And therefore they would steal a Christian child, murder that Christian child so that they could take his blood, and then they would use the blood to make matzah. Now, I'm sure all of you listening to this are either disgusted or think the whole thing is ridiculous. Who would ever believe such a ridiculous thing? But this was true, and not the story was true, but the fact that there was a libel like this was true, and it came up all the time. And it was a reason for pogroms against Jews. In a particular village, the word would go out, a child is missing. The Jews killed him. It would be always around this time for Passover. Sometimes the child really wasn't missing. Sometimes it was, but for whatever other reason. And this became a reason to go and murder the Jews. Now, I always said this is terrible and it's anti-Semitic, and it was, something I've known about forever. But actually, a Christian friend pointed out recently to me, isn't this ridiculous? Because Jews are so careful not to eat blood. Who would even imagine, if you're going to start creating a libel against the Jewish people, at least make it be a little bit more reasonable, because we do take this, our kosher laws, we take all of this very, very seriously, and we don't drink any blood. We don't eat blood. We don't use blood at all. And so, but I think it's important that we understand this was once a very serious thing, this blood libel, and many Jews lost their lives, and Christians believed it. This is what they were taught in certain places. In Europe, they were really taught this, which is insane, of course. And one of the things I would say is that we kind of come full circle, that I here am teaching all you Christians. I know there's a few Jews among you, but so many Christians, that I'm teaching about the real kosher laws, the real laws about blood, the real laws and customs about Passover. And I don't think any of you would even ever dream that we would be, murdering a child and using the blood for matzah. So in a way, we've come full circle, and we're not, and none of us are there anymore. But it is something that I wanted to just mention to you at the end of this lesson. So anyway, I hope, as I said, I don't know if this helped you understand any of this. I hope it gave you a little bit of insight, a little bit of meaning, but I'm happy to hear comments, questions, anything you might have.
I have two quick ones. I've heard those things through the years. It comes from ignorance and hatred. And I don't believe that is true, but I understand some of my Jewish friends have, with their seders, gone to the white wine so they wouldn't be accused of that. It's just
really
dumb.
Yes, my.
It's something like that. It's ignorance. It's just ignorance. And prayerfully, we will outgrow that with our Father. I just believe, God, that we will. The second thing I wanted to ask, someone put on there, and I didn't write it down quick enough. One of the reasons for not drinking the blood, and it was because it would make anger or cause anger. I don't know who wrote that down, but could somebody put that back in so I can write it down, please?
Well, I mentioned that one of the commentaries of Barbanel says that on the one hand, it connects blood with the life force and health, but on the other hand says when you get angry, your blood boils.
Adrenaline.
Not adrenaline. That's
somebody wrote it across the screen, Sondra.
Yeah, adrenaline, that I see. Blood carries the adrenaline caused by fear of slaughter. Chickens are hung upside down and drained of their own blood. Yes, we know that chickens are hung upside down, but we continue to salt in any case, just to be sure there's no more blood.
Thank you.
Okay, any other comments?
Sondra?
Yes.
Can you repeat the name of the 15th century Spanish sage that you were quoting?
Abarbanel, Abarbanel. That was his last name.
Thank you.
And
Don Isaac, he was a Don because he was of a high, Don Isaac Abarbanel.
Could you tell us what the Hebrew word is for blood?
Dam.
Thank you.
D-A-M, dam. Okay. Well, it's great to see you all. We will not be meeting next week. Next week, we read something else. We don't continue with Leviticus because next week it is still Passover, and we have a separate Passover reading. I have done a teaching on that I've taped, and you'll get that in your email next week on Friday. And we will reconvene the Leviticus class 2 weeks from today. It will still be 6 p.m. Israel time, but I think for some of you, it will go back to the original time that we had. It was just these 2 weeks we were off because we are only going to daylight savings time tonight, and some of you have already done that. So we will see you. You'll get a reminder email. I will see you all again in 2 weeks. Have a wonderful weekend, a wonderful Shabbat for those of you celebrating Passover. Have a wonderful Passover.
I hope you enjoyed that video, and we'd like to be sure you're getting all of our video content. So just click on the subscribe button below, as well as on the notification bell, and that way you will have easy access to all our material. We look forward to staying in touch with you. God bless you, and have a wonderful day.